G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now apologies for missing a video. Yesterday I had an absolutely massive day from 0500 through to about midnight on flying interstate to give a presentation, but all went well and I was happy to impart some of my knowledge. But today's video, of course, we will include yesterday and today. So we do have a lot of maps to look over. We do have some footage to look over, some geolocations of that footage, some vehicles from Belarus that have started showing up in areas of which we've had warning about a Belarusian buildup. And we need to talk about not only a new Ukrainian ballistic missile, we also need to look at length some of the maps and what would be the change if Ukraine got permissions to use long-range weapon systems like ATACMS or like your Storm Shadows within the Russian territory and how that would affect bombers and other pieces of infrastructure. That is one of the main calls for what we are seeing at the moment coming out of Ukraine. So what we are also going to talk of, separate from the maps, is Kursk, Pokrovsk. These are the two main areas that we will be looking at, and we're going to look at how directly those are affecting each other. We need to look at what Zelensky has said specifically about this. Now, this is actually where I want to begin. So just to show you on the maps, here we have Ukraine, the center, the capital of Kyiv. We have Kursk, Sumy, and of course, Ukraine's offensive across to here in blue. And then we have, of course, Donetsk Oblast, and we see this spire poking out here. This is where Avdiivka sat, and now the push onto Pokrovsk. So what we're going to do, of course, we need to look at the maps over a couple of days. We then will talk about some historical references in warfare from Karl von Clausewitz's On War and as well The Art of War and Sun Tzu, and see again why there's confusion about exactly what is happening in Kursk. And I've said from day one, I've been very open that I don't understand the tactical or maybe more the strategic value of this push when there's other areas that are really struggling. I get it, tactical for the POWs, the ability to gain some territory, but when we really zoom out and have a look overall, I have struggled to see the risk versus reward and the time frame of potentially then that November coming around. Now, I'm happy to be incorrect on any of this, but again, we want to talk about that. And I also want to be talking about maybe what Ukraine is doing in the east as well, as far as potentially their stepping rearwards. We'll line this up then with defensive works maps as well. Remember, all this, or most of it, will be available on the Telegram if I can't show you something or if you want to review something further. So where I want to start is this. This is at a press conference with the Ukrainian president, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, and a journalist from the Kyiv Independent. Now, his question shortly is, you mentioned that the Kursk offensive is part of pressuring Russia to end the war on more favourable terms for Ukraine, but the operation has been going on for 3 weeks and the advance towards Pokrovsk isn't slowing down. I'd like to understand what the favourable conditions can be discussed before stabilising the offensive of a key logistics hub in Donetsk Oblast. Now, this is where, and Zelensky does seem to bite back on this question a bit. Was there an advancement? Yes. Was it faster or slower? He says, the journalist says, same pace. Zelensky says here that it was faster before Ukraine's push into Kursk. This is something that I want to show you some numbers on that I believe is different. Now, personally, I believe from the maps, and I do this every single day, the offensive towards Pokrovsk has sped up since pushing into Kursk. And I want to show you some numbers that seem to reflect this. Now, what this graph here is done by a friend of mine is it breaks down Warmapper and Deep State's amount of ground change month to month. And as we can see on this, areas like in the 2023 counteroffensive here as well, where Ukraine is gaining ground, and you can see that Russia in August has had one of their best months. Now, what I've asked in August is don't include the 1,000 square kilometers around abouts that Ukraine has got in Kursk. Otherwise, these numbers would look skewed to try and get an idea of how much or if this has been speeding up in Donetsk, in Pokrovsk. Now, as well, this will slightly be skewed by maybe Ugledar, Pashani, but not that much because the square meterage isn't more. Now, what we can see is Russia, by deep states, Ukraine's MOD's map, or links to the MOD, by their own maps, has had, this is actually 20 squared kilometers incorrect today because it was only updated yesterday, so add 20 to this. Russia has had their best month of advancement, realistically, now since October last year, but especially then recently. Remember this one, you should add 20 onto here. We're not at the end of August yet. So by these numbers, by my analysis, not only has it continued, but I believe, and these numbers tend to show, that it has actually increased in speed as well since Ukraine had that movement into Kursk. Are they related? Yes, but in a different way. And Zelensky explains here that in similar to Bakhmut, this idea of then the meat grinder, that Russia will lose 50 to 60,000 people. Now, this is what Ukraine's outwardly plan has been a lot for the past, now well over a year, is this idea, this strategy of attriting down the Russian forces. They're losing so many guys being thrown into this that eventually the ability to continue offensive actions will fall over, and the recruitment, the training is not going to meet the losses at the front. Now, again, this is very hard to actually analyze when we don't really know, we have no real idea of what those numbers actually are at the front line. And I want to talk about prolonged and attritional warfare just in a second. But we need to be in a powerful position at the Peace Summit. Of course, talking one that will be either in India or maybe Saudi, we believe, but mediated there that Russia may attend as well in a strong situation. Everything will end in dialogue, but we need to have strong positions going into that dialogue. And like I said, that before, about 3 weeks ago, the Kursk offensive, if there was to be a peace negotiation conference, the amount of cards on the table that Ukraine would actually have would have been a lot less. Now, at least they have about 250 to 300 cards of POWs that were taken there. I believe that's around about the number that's being reported, and about 1,000 square kilometers as well. So it has increased somewhat their ability for that. If there is a negotiated process in November, again, I don't know if that's going to go ahead. Again, it doesn't seem that Russia is actually interested in that, so from some of the messaging coming out from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Kremlin as well. But look, we've looked over the gains that speed up. Now I want to have a look at the maps, then we'll talk about some historical stuff that may be sitting there as well. Is Ukraine stepping back and Russia overextending? Where do the defensive works sit? How is that attritional prolonged warfare maybe in Ukraine's best interests, as we have discussed previously? Now, straight off the bat, this as well. So there is a, starting tomorrow, movement of restrictions, and this is now 24 hours old, apologies. That will be in effect from 1500 to then 1100. Is the list of settlements which the new rules apply. Now, what we'll do is I've actually highlighted these areas on the deep state map, almost all of them, that there are new restrictions in these areas. I have contacted someone in the area who's saying that there is mass evacuations and a lot of movement of armor around these areas as well. And as you can see, the areas, especially on the way to Pokrovsk, are under strict curfew and or being then evacuated too. So there's obvious risk on this. Let's look at the maps, and then we'll look at maybe some historical sort of doctrine as well. So let's look at Kursk, and then we'll look at Pokrovsk, and where, because I believe these two are directly influenced on each other, that this was to try and stop that, and Pokrovsk is maybe potentially speeding up because Russia hasn't taken the bait. That doesn't mean that in the future there may not have to be a redeployment into here as well. So this map, Deep State, hasn't showed any changes in here for a good few days. We jump onto the Noel reports map in here, and although we see where there's active localities and fighting, there hasn't been any movement really in the past, say 2 or 3 days. The most recent, I believe, is here on the 26th. So this has really slowed down. Now, there was some localized fighting on the border to Belgorod. Again, what has become of that in the 24 hours, it doesn't seem like that much. We thought that Ukraine may have been pushing another offensive across into Russia, but it seems to have fizzled out. The reporting on that yesterday was really, really patchy. So on these maps, this does seem like, I don't want to say stabilized, but those large swaths of land we saw fall again and again has seemed to really grind down. Now, interestingly, that Suryak actually does paint a different photograph to this, as he does show then in his two updates in here. So he's showing that this has filled in out to the west, and this is not significantly different between the two. But in the east, he does show some different areas. Of course, this advancement up here is shown on this map as well. But he is showing, if we take Martinyovka, which is this red dot just about here on this road, that it is showing that Ukraine have control right out into some of these areas up in here. So he's showing far more control out into the northeast of this push, or north of Sudzha. Now, as well, he talks about Ukrainian troops re-entered Borky, where clashes are taking place. Now, of course, Borky sits down in here, still shown under control by this map. Suryak reported a couple of days ago that Borky came under control of the Russians, and then it looks like Ukraine has been pushed back into there, and there is some ongoing fighting here as well. Sudzha axis, this is then his next map. The Ukrainian army re-entered and recaptured most of the area of Ruskaya Konopelka. Now, you'll know this area due to, this is where we spoke about that BMP 3v2. This is Ruskaya Ponokelka, right where then my cursor is over here. So you can see that Suryak is still showing a lot more on this map as well. So there is some movements in here, both back and forward. Again, so hard on such a maneuverable liquid front like this to get a good idea of then what is actually going on in here. But as well, it does look like, to a certain degree, Russia is trying to limit Ukraine's logistics into here by striking some bridges. Of course, we have seen Ukraine strike the bridges across the same river to try and do the same to Russia around Gloshkovo. Now, we got then this video yesterday of this bridge in Ukraine being hit by Russian munitions. And then this has been geolocated then to here. So what we can see on this is Sumy. This is the bridge at the pin drop up into Sumy. And these are the areas we're speaking about of Kotonovo, Sudzha. You can see that that is one of the main arterial roads that are running up into this front. So there is still a lot of active attempts to try and stabilize or limit the amount that can come into here. Now, let's look at Pokrovsk. Let's look at where things are shifting. So what we need to do is step back to yesterday. Now, ignore other movements. We're going to talk about them in a bit. As we can see, last time I spoke to you was the 27th. We jumped to the 28th, and we can see an increase in control. Memrik and Novohorivka has come under control too. Novohorivka is a fairly major town in here. I believe 10 to about 14,000 people, but big thing in here is how much close this is then growing towards Pokrovsk. And of course, in the south, this movement down in here, this is then by deep state as well, that they have got Memrik under control due to a Russian flag being raised up in here. Now, one thing we can say in here, due to the attritional grinding of the front in here, it's a lot easier to say, yep, this is where the forces are, rather than up in somewhere like Kursk. Kursk will become like that if Ukraine choose to stay at the front line. It then slows down and it's more of a grind. Again, all maneuver warfare, at some point does turn into a more prolonged attritional warfare once the correct elements come into play. Now let's look at Pokrovsk front over a couple of Suryak maps over the past 2 days as well. And as you can see down towards Memrik, Kalinivka, that the south down here, that pushing in, as well as Krasnaya Yar, as well as Novohorivka, then coming under more control of the Russian forces in here, entering these areas, and then up to the most recent one by Suryak again, showing movement then to the south of Memrik, Mykolaiivka coming under control, and then closing up a lot of these gaps around Novohorivka, as well as in Horodka, that there's more Russian control in here shown by Suryak than what is being shown on deep state, as well as even pushes out to the north, fattening and broadening this front line to try and have effect if there is some level of cut off further back. Remember, this is what a lot of people were saying ever since Osharetne, that there is going to be some push to try and do one of these maneuvers on Russia in here. But the fattening of this and the continual fattening does limit the ability to do that. Now we're talking well over 20 kilometers as this goes out and fattens that girth maneuver that we then speak about. You can see through this and you can read through this if you'd like on his Telegram or on mine about what he sees and what specifically has come under control there. But to try and keep this shorter, I won't. Now, Noel reports, Ukrainian source here, he has shown this movement down towards Memlik, and he also shows where there is fighting reported out from Madanivkia near Selidove as well, and in some other areas. He's far more conservative towards Russian gains than some of the other maps. Again, I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong in here. What I'm showing you is different maps to get an idea. Now, we'll talk about this area more at length. And Surek has written this. This is his assessment. It is already difficult to speak of a war of attrition on the Pokrovsk front. The Ukrainian army continues to withdraw gradually without offering much resistance. It seems that the Ukrainian command intends to entrench itself in Pokrovsk, Minorad conurbation, and try to hold out there until November. However, given the pace of Russian army's advances, it is difficult to know whether the stronghold will hold out until then. And from my contacts, we know a lot of people are leaving these areas. We know some armour is moving into these areas, and we can see that there are a lot of defensive lines, if I can turn this then on, around Pokrovsk. But there are also a lot of defensive lines that very quickly came under control in here too, with the momentum of the initiative that Russia do hold in this front that is being affected, I believe, directly from Pokrovsk. If we look at the increase in speed of this over the numbers that I showed you, that numbers from Warmapper and Deep State, both very conservative towards Russian gains, and how that effect may be there. Now, like I've said, Russia may have tried to rebait Ukraine in a way that Ukraine pushed in here to try and get Russian forces to push and then stabilize this. Russia may have gone, the best defensive is offensive. We push super fucking hard down here, and they may have to then move their forces back in here. Now, this is where I've spoken about some doctrine before, attritional prolonged warfare, and why some of this isn't making sense to me. So the question I want to ask you guys is Ukraine actively stepping rearwards in the Pokrovsk front? Now, we have said that a lot of doctrine and historical information about attritional prolonged warfare, that trading ground for time is a good strategy. And if you are numerically inferior, a really good strategy. So trading ground for time is probably in Ukraine's best interest. You do this until you are ready to launch offensive actions and you want to fight the enemy on ground of your choosing, whereas most advantageous for yourself. We spoke about this with the Vovchansk front, that it had a long way till Kharkiv. There wasn't too many areas in there that seemed super strategically important. So could there be a pullback in here to attrit the Russian forces down as they come and then fight them in areas that are best on your choosing? But what I say in here, and we talk about, you want to do this in areas that aren't too strategically important, and your defensive lines, depending, that risk versus reward, sort of that fulcrum that sits between the two and where you actually want to find a happy balance. The areas and lines that are falling in here seem not only to be very tactically important, but they're very strategically important, especially Pokrovsk and the defensive works, if Russia was able to get in behind those defensive works as well. And it does seem that Russia is grinding forward very slowly and widening the front as they go, not to get overextended. So this is what you could do, is you could bait your enemy to draw in, get overextended, and then you have an offensive on it. But it has seemed it's been sort of slow and methodical, very grind, and that's very difficult. If you're grinding, digging defensive works, grinding, digging defensive works, that is what the Polish soldier told, or the ex-Polish soldier working in Ukraine for a couple of years. If you listen to that interview, he was saying that Russians push forward a little bit and dig in straight away, push forward. So he said it's very hard to actually have a counter maneuver on that as well. Things that come fast go fast, things that come slow tend to stay around. And the main thing in this trading land for time in attritional war is you get time to mobilize your forces, and that's what you're trying to do, is you're trading, so you gain you're not letting up too much areas of strategic importance to give yourself times to mobilize in the tens or hundreds of thousands of new soldiers. And to public knowledge, this doesn't really seem to be happening in Ukraine to the significant amount that we would know if Ukraine was to go back on the offensive, what it would say. So that's where what I'm saying is I just don't really understand some of the decisions being made into here as well. But is there some other plan at play by Ukraine here to step back to more advantageous positions, and that Russia may get really caught off guard in here somewhere? Again, my background in what my research and understanding, I don't really see this. I've spoken about the 4D chess moves that play in this are very limited this far into an attritional prolonged war. But again, like with everything this wartime will tell, and you can't then just disregard anything like that either. Now, let's have a look at some other bits and pieces. Now, one thing I do want to say, on this, is there's no question for Kursk, for the offensive to Kursk, there's no question of Ukraine's right to cross into Russia. They can do whatever they want. They've been attacked. They can go back into Russia. They can do whatever. But it's more of a question of, is this strategically the correct decision and movements to actually be made? And this is where my brain is struggling to comprehend what is going on. So let's look at this article here written by Mr. James Holmes. So the Greats agree Ukraine's Kursk offensive is strategic malpractice. He talks about Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian soldier, described the everlasting renown, contacts opening secondary theatres or operations under certain circumstances, but he did so grudgingly, so opening up a new offensive line somewhere. Clausewitz cautioned commanders to divert forces only on a not-to-interfere basis with success in the primary theatre, which after all represents the theatre of greatest consequences as the leadership defines it. The primary theatre of this war, currently throughout this war, even pre-2022 invasion, has been Donbass, Donetsk front. That you can divert forces, but not to interfere on this basis. Now, Clausewitz, this is all old stuff. It's still taught in all major military colleges around the war. And what is meaning in here, and this is just something, a bit of a write out, is it is more important to use one's forces in the principal operation than to dissipate them in secondary operations. The object of secondary operations must always be to either assist the main operation or exploit its success, but never to act independently or on their own account. And this is where I can't see that, given this, how the Kursk is exploiting successes then in Pokrovsk, and how this is so independent doesn't seem to line up with Clausewitz's teachings. Now, I do recommend to read On War by Karl von Clausewitz. If you can get a copy that's more not what his book is actually, like what he wrote, if you can get someone who's actually broken it down, that may be easier, at least first off. It is a very difficult book to read, depending on your level of reading and your understanding. I know I really struggled my way through a lot of it as well, and asking both friends and certain AIs as well, actually, to break down what some things meant and further research. But either way, if nothing else, strategy means to be setting and enforcing priorities. This takes self-discipline. It makes little strategic sense to hazard what matters most for the sake of something that matters less, no matter how beguiling. For Ukraine, a combatant that stands in the moral peril and foremost priority must be to hold as much Ukrainian ground as possible while striving to regain lost ground. Kursk is great from a fist-pumping standpoint. Apart from that, its benefits appear lackluster. Like I've said from day one and copped a lot of flack, I don't understand the Kursk offensive if it hasn't drawn the amount of Russian forces away. Well, I get it for morale. I get it for other areas. The morale in Kyiv and Lviv may be increased from that, but the morale, if you're a soldier in Pokrovsk moving rearwards, I don't think you give a shit about Kursk, and that's somewhat what I'm hearing as well. So there is, what is the overall goal in here? Clausewitz enunciated a simple formula to help the leadership fathom whether to open a secondary theatre or operation. Some years ago, I took calling it Clausewitz 3 R's: reward, risk, resources. A new endeavour that is must not merely promise nice to have gains, it must be exceptionally rewarding. So It can't just be nice to have, it needs to be super rewarding if you're willing to then open up something on a completely new endeavor. Is there anything in that Kursk region other than a few hundred POWs and a couple of thousand square kilometers that is exceptionally rewarding? I personally don't believe so. When you're talking a few thousand square kilometers and to 106 to 108,000 square k's that Russia have on the other hand, where I think the Pokrovsk for Russia could be exceptionally rewarding. The notion of wresting territory from Russia exudes a certain allure on the logic that paybacks are hell. But do the prospective rewards qualify as exceptional? It's hard to see how. Let's move on here. But there's more to the calculus than forecasting rewards. Clausewitz cautions the commander running undue risk in the principal theatre in order to pursue lesser aims elsewhere. And he defines risk in terms of resources available to the principal theatre. Only decisive superiority of resources in the main theatre can justify siphoning resources into a secondary effort. With the siphoning of resources, moving resources away to open a secondary effort, I tell you where I would have launched something, would have been probably over and around here with the amount of troops that actually sit in here versus the amount of resources that we know are there. Now, only if a candidate theatre or operation passes all three tests, the reward versus risk and resources are there should the venture proceed. Does anyone think that Ukrainian armed forces command decisive military superiority over Russia in eastern Ukraine? So does anyone think that Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine currently have military superiority in the east? No. If you look numerically, no, and where the border is moving as well. Unless they do, Kiev is courting unacceptable risk in Kursk. In all likelihood, he would fault Ukrainian military and political leaders for strategic indiscipline. Again, what I will say in this is we don't exactly know what the overall goal in here is, and we don't know how much is being attributed by the Russians, how many Russian forces are being attributed in Kursk as well. Again, the numbers are so bloody hard to know, but the amount of footage coming out of it too doesn't seem to be as much as something like Bakhmut was either. As the force ratio dwindles, the less venturesome the commander can afford to be. Acting otherwise flirts with danger. If numerically weaker, Sun Tzu, have a read this, you'll read through it in a day, but it is really good to bounce even just your life off. Be capable of withdrawing. Again, like we spoke about, is Ukraine pulling back to get a ground for time? Something that this talks about in this book here. This is really good, actually. I'm only halfway through, but planning for protraction, and where some of the Western doctrine may be incorrect if we step into a long protracted war. And if all respects are unequal, be capable of eluding him. For a small force is but booty for a powerful one. So keep maneuvering, keep moving, but then the ability to move around the battlefield as well. And again, with these lessons, I don't know how Kursk fits in. Since 2022, the Ukrainian army has outperformed expectations by a wide margin, by a huge margin, and Russia has underperformed expectations by the same large margin. That should not mask the fact that Ukraine is and will remain the lesser antagonist confronting a bulkier, better resourced neighbour that sees vital interests at stake. Russia is always going to be numerically a much larger force, and at least in short term and middle term is going to have the numerical superiority in the air and the artillery as far as the king of the battlefield in artillery. It is weaker by most indices and must conduct itself accordingly. So what I've said is, if you are the smaller force, lengthening that front line, that push into Kursk, it doesn't seem like the smaller force typically does not have that as an option for itself to lengthen the front line and push on the offensive. If it is that risk versus reward versus resource, then having ground loss already and now increasing in the east. This is where I want the Kursk to be successful, but from all my background, I just can't really make sense of it overall. But I'm happy to be wrong, and I'm also, if Ukraine is falling back here, massively attriting down the Russians, and there will be something in here. Again, that is something to take into account, that could be exactly happening as well. By the methodical, very slow grind forward, I don't know exactly if that is happening, but what we have seen is Russia have entered areas like Novhorodka that have very little damage, and maybe Ukraine is actively having a pullback. Is that actively pulling back to bring the Russians into some trap and treat them down as they go, or is it actively pulling back because there's no other option to do that due to the defensive works falling quickly? Again, we don't know, but if we jump onto a map like this, it tends to tell some of that story when we see the amount of defensive works that are coming under control and the danger in if they get in behind Pokrovsk, the defensive works, then for a western push in behind other defensive works down in Ugledar and the defensive works that sit all the way to Zap as well. Now, is there going to be some huge sloth of 2,000 square Ks? No, but could we see it then increase? I think there's a lot of dangers in here. And that's what I'm saying is my military knowledge is maybe not great enough. I don't understand that Kursk Offensive. I haven't from day one either, whether from, like he says, the fist pumping point of view. And a lot of my knowledge is based on like texts that we have read. I'm happy to be incorrect on this as well. In many cases, I hope I'm incorrect on this. Now, let's have a look at maps in then other areas of the front. Now, let's then step back. Did I ever show you today's map on this one? Sorry. Today's map, we see a small push out from Avrovka and Mykolaiivka as well. Sorry, I'm an idiot. So let's step down into Ugledar. And then yesterday we saw some changes around here, just to the northeast of Ugledar, Konstantinivka, Vodiane. And then we see today more stepping up. Then on the western side of Ugledar, and to the eastern side of Ugledar as well. And Deep State give us a good idea of what Russia is trying to do here. The enemy has been active in two areas, west of Pavlivka, and the action is clear to bypass Ugledar and take it into a ring. So to envelop Ugledar, Russia, we know over a year or more has taken huge losses and have failed to actually get a foothold and push into Ugledar. We had sort of massive attrition of forces here that now this looks like they're trying just to push around and actually envelop that rather than push through itself. Again, for the Russian attacks we've seen on many areas, that is seemingly what they've done. They did it in Mariupol, they did it in Bakhmut, they did it in Avdiivka, the strategic envelopment, the withdrawal, and then take the territory. So what we can see is out towards then Vodiane as well. If we zoom in, sorry, this is Konstantinivka. Up in this direction, we can see that 2 days ago, Russia made some ground as well as ground down just to the south of Vodiane. That lines up then with this map. Then we step forward here, get rid of that. And then we can see a further push, said to be by Syriac, through Konstantinivka itself, right up then to where this reservoir is sitting, and a much larger push then up onto this road, then running all the way through here, except for a small portion up here. So these maps realistically are actually very, very close to each other. Now, while we're in this, let's actually just jump back up into Pokrovsk. If Russia really do try on Pokrovsk, will we see a frontal assault, or typically what we've seen of try to maybe envelop something? This still has a lot of time before that is under huge threat of fully coming under control, we at least presume. So we'll come then to the northeast of that front, and we need to look at the New York Toretsk front in here. So yesterday, again, turn this on, no real changes. Step up to today, and we have seen some more ground made into Toretsk, out from Pivnechny, as well as out to the west of this New York front as well. Still showing some entrapment of soldiers here. Again, I don't know exactly what is happening in here. So let's have a look in here. Sorry, Syriac then does show in the same area, at least just to the south of this Toretsk front, that he's saying between Zalizny and Toretsk is getting filled in. Again, probably somewhere between the two. There may not be forces there, but there may not be anyone's forces in here as well. Now, let's just move down south a little bit, and then we'll work our way back up. Otokiv, Robotny front, where the defensive works sat in through here. I don't even know how to turn these on anymore, but we know that this map, to Noel's, to every other map, does show significantly different when it comes to Robotny and geolocations as well in here. And today, Syriac is actually showing that this has been almost completely closed up. So this red dot, this is Robotny right in here, this road. See where this comes out? That dot sits like here. He's saying then all of this basically has actually been closed back up last week. Russian army took control of the series positions. Novotny thus leveling the salient around the location. Again, this is where Ukraine had some of its most success in the 2023 counter-offensive. This map does not reflect that. Again, we know there's some geolocations in here. We'll get a better idea of what exactly is happening. Now, this Novomylivka Konstantinivka front we did speak of yesterday, we saw some gain. Noel reports he also reflects this gain as well for Russian presence in Konstantinivka, and much further out in the grey zone as well. You can have presence without control out around about here. There was Russian presence in there. That ties up the rest of then the Ugledar front. Now, Mariinka, somewhere we haven't spoken about a bit, but of course was very relevant about, maybe 8 months ago, where we saw that push through Mariinka. Horovka, of course, moving very slowly in here, because you can see the purple of where even the 2014 line then is. And Syriac is saying today that Russia made small advances northwest of Mariinka, so just up in here there was some small advance, but of course you can see where these maps are different for Maximilivka as well as Horovka as well on these maps. Eventually we will get a much better idea of where these maps actually are sitting. So let's move up into the northeast at the Pishani front. Now today, no change. Yesterday. I reckon this map is playing tricks on me now. Here we go. Yesterday, we did see this push out down in here, maybe the day before. Regardless, this wasn't being reflected across Syriac's map on the day. Now we do have that this is being reflected, that push down to the south as well. So we can confirm that 100% then happened. Now let's have a look at overall, I guess, strategic shit. Of course, this is Kyiv in here. This is the border between Ukraine and Belarus. We've had a lot of reporting coming out of Ukraine that Belarus is putting up to 30% of its forces somewhere on the border, and the threat of something occurring there, and Ukraine saying back, if you do that, we'll deem everything a military target and we will start bombing back in. But also the threat, if Belarus did choose to open a front, that would more than, of course, stretch the Ukrainian forces even further. I've seen many people say Ukraine make easy work of Belarus, potentially in just normal times, but when so many forces are allocated into Kursk and in the east, any lengthening of front line to the numerically inferior military is going to be a huge struggle. And what we're seeing, it's not very inventive, but a B on the side of these vehicles saying is a combat marking for maybe the Belarusian force open up in here. Again, not 100% sure. Let's have a look over some footage. Now, this is an interesting bit of footage here. This happened in Kursk. This is an Australian Bushmaster. It's wild to see what vehicles I used to command being hit in Kursk by then an FPV drone straight into the front, then engine bay here, and further on the footage, then completely destroying then the bushy, the old Wombat looking vehicle here too. And what you'll see is the FPS, the frames per second, is very high on this. What this actually is, Akhmat here, what we believe is one of these wire-guided drones, which we have seen in New York a little bit, but of course in Kursk mainly, these drones being guided by a fiber optic cable, very similar to like a tow missile, and that, of course, can't be jammed by any sense of EW. And these are very interesting due to they can't be jammed by EW, so you need an offensive weapon to hit it, rather than more of a passive system. You can see the triangle for the Kursk region up in here. So that too, the development of those weapon systems, the fiber optics, we will see more and more in warfare, countering then those EW. Of course, there's little drawbacks to those, but still very interesting to see them being used actually more and more. Now, Ukrainian pages and Ukrainian official pages have then claimed a downing of another Su-25 Frogfoot. This is like a close air support plane, very similar to like an A-10 Warthog, which you're more familiar with, and saying that this one here, the bottom one, has been struck and has then crashed. Now, what I will say in this is there is some contention over then what has actually occurred with dropping those. Those are definitely flares. That looks to be another flare, and the footage does cut off early. We'd expect to see a large fireball from the fuel alone if this plane crashes. And Fighter Bomber has pushed back, and he has said that this is just a maneuver with flares firing. So I want to ask you guys, what do you think? Is this one going down, or are they flares popped? Those are definitely flares, but or is that something hitting it, or there as well? We see the other one, or it going down. We know these are very low quality footage. It's hard to tell as well. And I'll give you another bit of footage to see. This is a Su-25, then popping flares, very low on a bank. So you can see that that's the flare pattern come out. So very similar to that, secondary flares. Again, this was actually in the Kursk, this was both in Donetsk region. I don't believe it's the same footage, but they both have come out then today. Again, I think from this, I probably think it's flares. I don't know why the footage cut off, because you would see a large fireball of that hitting, and then of course everything's dry out there. You'd see then burning. So I think potentially it was flares, but again, I'm open to be incorrect on anything. So a lot of messaging about Ukraine trying to get their longer range weapon systems and permission to use those inside of Russia. What I've said is I don't think straight off the bat this is going to be the amount of game changer that a lot of people, anytime you use game changer, that's your first mistake, that people may think. We see this was from an official Defense of Ukraine page only today. The restrictions on military facilities inside Russia must be lifted. We have to kill the anchor, not the arrow. So kill, this is a Tu-95, not in the missile coming. The thing is with these are very, very long range planes. They're still a long way away. Russia is an incredibly massive country if you look at it on the bloody globe. Now, this is something you'll see commonly pop up with that. This is where these systems, the ATACMS, the GLSDB, can fire inside of Ukraine, in areas like Crimea itself, but also then out in Russian territory. But what I'm here to say is the thing is, when we have seen, I think the Wall Street Journal said 90% of those bombers or aircraft have been moved out of the range of these. And this is something we need to then take into account, that a KH101, which some of these bombers fire, range of 2,500 kilometers to 2,800 kilometers. So still well outside of the range of any of those Storm Shadow scalp ATACMS, well outside of that, both the bomb on the ground and where those can fire as well. Even something like a Tomahawk, which would have a huge effect, still, you're talking 2,400 kilometers, a hell of a long way. But again, still in some bases outside of in the ranges of those. But again, something like this would have then a huge, huge effect. Again, we see then this. US policy continues to shield Russian military targets. That no major Russian air military bases are inside of the range of the GMLRS, that they've moved out the yellow, and where the permission of them is to fire, and ranges of certain weapon systems. Of course, the red is the ATACMS at max range, and the yellow is the HIMARS, where Ukraine is allowed to use them too. And of course, Russia hasn't moved things here. What I've said is, I think very quickly, this have a huge effect on things like helicopters and some of the fighter aircraft, but the long-range bombers that were in these areas are just going to move back and back and back. Of course, it then has a huge effect further on, because those bombers have to be further away. You're going to get longer range of those missiles. You're going to get more warning about them coming in. But will it just cripple those long-range strategic aircraft? No. You're going to need really, really long-range shit to actually strike them. I think Ukraine's best bet in this, because any of these long-range weapons are going to be incredibly expensive, and you're not going to have many of them, is looking at the same successes Ukraine is having. What does Ukraine have success in? Long-range strikes is with drones, and it have massive numbers of them going in and basically just wearing out the Russian air defense, because there's so many of them, and then having strikes rather than having one or two ballistic missiles or Tomahawks or something, because the air defense will be keeping up more easily, having one or two targets to intercept rather than having 50, 100 drones coming in. Drone swarms are the absolute future of warfare. And this is the Atlas oil facility in Rostov on fire. And this is no different when we look at how far Ukrainian drones have flown to strike this. Some almost 1,200 kilometers, well outside the range of a lot of those ballistic systems as well. Did I show you this footage? This is oil facility in Rostov on fire too. So where is the success on that? This is one of the things with the Russian strategic bombers, is how far they can fly themselves, how far the missiles themselves have, and where the bases can actually sit and how they can move backwards. This is one of the huge problems with those as well, in time that they're actually able to be intercepted in the air by things like Patriot if they're in range at all, more meaning things like your Su-34s. But Ukraine has then spoken about its first test of its HRI M2 ballistic missiles, first ballistic missile here, and this is just a mock-up of the vehicle itself. And we can see Zelensky has spoken a little bit about this, but not too much. Ukraine has tested its first ballistic missile. The result was positive. It successfully launched its first missile drone as well, the Palanyatsia, which we have seen that could have a lot of effect as well. Of course, it's probably going to be cheaper. The range is probably going to be a lot further as well. Positive test. I congratulate military production. Claimed to be around a 700-kilometer range on that, therefore bringing Moscow inside of the areas that ballistic could hit. So it'll be interesting just to see what Ukraine can actually do about these bombers getting up and airborne. But I think at the moment, drones are probably a better option in mass numbers, domestically produced against these long range, maybe different from than ballistic missiles, especially if those ballistics aren't made in huge quantities or domestically produced. Domestically produced, they can use them anywhere, but if they're not, we have seen the UK isn't willing really to move much on that. The very interesting thing was when they were putting the R37s or R73, basically like a analog of a Sidewinder on the boat drone, having the drone boats go out into the Black Sea, extending the range on those air-to-air missiles, guiding in and hitting some aircraft as well, we believe, successfully to get more range on those. And of course, if Ukraine can make advances in the east, that's going to extend the range of some of these systems as well. Anyway, Legends, a long video today. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.